3:20 in the morning, Tokyo time, December 8th, 1941. 6,400 kilometers to the east, the American battleship USS Arizona is rolling on her side. More than 900 sailors' fathers, husbands, teenagers who lied about their age to enlist are still inside her hull. Some of them are still alive. The oil is on fire. The water is on fire. And by the next morning, in Kansas, in Alabama, in the small towns where their mothers are still asleep, the telegrams will start. On the other side of that ocean, in a bay called Hashirajima, a 57-year-old Japanese admiral named Yamamoto Isoroku sits in a room full of cheering officers. He is not cheering, because in the next few hours, the radio receivers his empire spent 10 years building for one purpose, to listen to America, are going to tell him something no man in that room wants to hear. That the war he just won this morning, he has already lost. They will pick up a football game in New York, interrupted for 30 seconds, then resumed. They will pick up a speech that lasts 6.5 minutes. One word inside it enough to erase every option the plan depended on. They will pick up a vote of 388 to 1, and a woman hiding in a telephone booth. Japan is about to spend the next 44 months learning what her own listening posts already heard on the first morning. This is the story of what came through the static. The Nagato rides at anchor in Hashirajima Bay on the inland sea of Japan, and every clock on her bridge is set to 2 times. One reads Tokyo, the other reads Hawaii. Between them stretches an ocean, and the war that has just been launched across it. It is the 8th of December, 1941, by the calendar of the ship. In the operations room below, staff officers stand over harbor charts, drawn from photographs no Japanese sailor has ever taken. A single bare bulb burns overhead. Coffee cools in white cups. Somewhere in the passage outside, a young ensign counts steps between the door and the radio room, and counts them again. At the center of it, seated, quiet, is a man who does not look like the architect of anything. He is 57 years old, short, thick through the shoulders. 2 fingers of his left hand are missing, taken by a Russian shell at Tsushima in 1905, the last time Japan made war on a great power and won. His name is Yamamoto Isoroku, and he is the commander of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He designed the operation that is now unfolding 6,000 kilometers away. He also spent years arguing it should never be necessary. The men in the room know part of that story. They do not know all of it. Yamamoto studied at Harvard between 1919 and 1921. He served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. In those years, he did what few Japanese officers ever did. He drove across the American continent. He saw the oil fields of Texas, where derricks stood in numbers no map in Tokyo could reproduce. He saw Detroit, where a single plant could roll out more automobiles in a month than his entire island empire produced in a year. He walked American cities and heard American radios in American living rooms, and he understood something the army faction back home refused to hear. When the government pressed toward war, he told Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro exactly what his fleet could deliver. 6 months, perhaps a year. Beyond that, he said, he could promise nothing. The government heard the first half of that sentence, not the second. So Yamamoto designed the only kind of war the first half allowed. A blow so sudden, so heavy, so complete, that America, divided, isolationist, still voting session after session to stay out of Europe's fight and Asia's, would count the cost of a long ocean war and choose to negotiate instead. The ships at Pearl Harbor were the target, but the ships were never the objective. The objective lived inside the American mind. At 3:20 in the morning, the radio room receives the first signal from the strike commander over Oahu. 3 syllables repeated. Shida Mitsuo, a commander in the Naval Air Service, 39 years old, promoted only weeks earlier, is transmitting from an aircraft over the harbor. 2, attack. Minutes later, another signal follows. Different, denser. It means complete surprise has been achieved. Tora, Tora, Tora. In the operations room, the officers erupt, cups slide, a hand slaps a chart. Somewhere aft, a sailor laughs into his sleeve because he does not know what else to do. Yamamoto does not move. An officer standing near him will remember, years later, the admiral's face at that moment. Not triumphant. Heavy, as if he had already been handed a second message no one else in the room had received. Because the harbor is not the only thing his instruments are listening to. For years now, in windowless rooms across the empire, Japan has been building a machine for hearing America. At the Domei News Agency in Tokyo, monitors sit with headphones pressed hard against their ears, hunting American frequencies across the Pacific. Commercial stations from the West Coast, network bulletins from Chicago and New York, shortwave carriers out of San Francisco and Honolulu. The Foreign Ministry, the Gaimusho, runs its own listening desks. So does the Navy. For a decade, those desks have been transcribing the same sound. Senators denouncing foreign entanglements, crowds cheering neutrality, a movement called America, first filling stadiums with tens of thousands of ordinary Americans who want no part of anyone else's war. That sound is the foundation the whole strategy stands on. The whole logic in Tokyo's war councils runs simple, clean, and reassuring. A nation of merchants, a nation softened by comfort, a nation that will not bleed for years over islands it cannot pronounce. Deliver the catastrophe in a single morning, seize an unbreakable perimeter across the Pacific, and the isolationists on the American radio will do the rest of the work. That is the plan. No one, in 10 years of listening, has tested what those American voices will sound like after the catastrophe actually arrives. The monitors lean forward now, pencils ready. The war has begun, and the second phase of it, the phase that Yamamoto actually cares about, is about to be measured. They are listening for panic, for confusion, for the sound of a country recoiling from the blow. Through the static, the first American bulletin begins to crackle in. It is not a government transmitter, it is not a news anchor, it is a sports broadcast. Station War in New York is carrying a professional football game from the Polo Grounds. Brooklyn Dodgers against the New York Giants. Autumn afternoon in America. 55,000 fans in the stands. Play-by-play voice pauses mid-sentence. A bulletin is read. Flat, controlled, short. Japanese aircraft have attacked Pearl Harbor. Then the game resumes. The monitors in Tokyo transcribe it precisely. And what they are transcribing is the absence of the thing they were sent to find. Across the American afternoon, the pattern repeats. CBS reads the bulletin. NBC reads it. Mutual Broadcasting reads it. Then each network returns to scheduled programming while newsrooms scramble in the background for detail. The voices are measured, almost procedural. Casualty reports are withheld. Rumors are flagged as unconfirmed. On the West Coast, where Japanese planners might reasonably expect terror of invasion, radio stations relay civil defense instructions in the tone of a weather advisory. Blackout procedures. Report to your air raid posts. Stay tuned. A nation that was supposed to shatter is instead organizing itself hour by hour on the air. The intercept summaries move up through the staff of the Nagato. The officers around Yamamoto are still writing the strike reports. Nothing in their training tells them a burning battleship fleet can coexist with a calm radio announcer. The doctrine they were raised on measures war in hulls sunk and formations broken. By that measure, this morning is the greatest naval victory in Japanese history. By the measure the plan actually requires, no result has arrived yet. Yamamoto reads the picture differently because he is the only man in the room who has ever stood inside the country on the other end of those broadcasts. When he told Kono 6 months, the number was not modesty. It was arithmetic. The radio is now telling him the arithmetic has started to run. And then, threaded through the American bulletins, there is a second sound the foreign ministry monitors understand better than anyone. A single word repeated across networks. Treachery. A blow delivered while diplomats still talked in Washington. Yamamoto had insisted on the sequence. Warning first, then war. A blow to the fleet, not to honor. In the Japanese embassy in Washington, diplomats had been ordered to type and deliver a 14-part message breaking off negotiations. It was meant to reach the American Secretary of State before the first bomb fell. That was the design. The typing ran late, the delivery ran later. By the time the message reached Cordell Hull, the ships in Hawaii had been burning for almost an hour. American radio has seized the sequence, and it has made it the story. The failed hour of typing at that embassy has just given the enemy its rallying cry. Yamamoto had demanded that timing for exactly this reason. A blow delivered after a declaration is war. A blow delivered before one is something else. Something that closes the door his entire strategy needs left open. The door to negotiation. He does not yet know why the message ran late. He knows only what the receivers are telling him. The attack he designed to bend the will of 130 million Americans is, in its first 24 hours, hardening it instead. Weeks later, in a letter to his old friend Ogata Takatora, he will put it in a single line. A military man, he will write, can scarcely pride himself on smiting a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame. That is later. For now, on the Nagato, the celebration is still building. Sake is being poured. The chief of staff is drafting a message to Tokyo. A junior officer, hands shaking with something he cannot name, drops a pencil and picks it up twice. Corner of the room, the receivers keep pulling in the calm American voices. The interrupted football game, the measured bulletins, the West Coast weather advisory tone. The first day of the war is only a few hours old, and already the plan that everything depends on is beginning to make a sound Yamamoto does not want to name. Through the American afternoon of December 7th, the monitors keep logging. At the domi desks in Tokyo, tea grows cold in unwashed cups. Pencils wear down. A senior man walks past the row of listening stations once every hour and does not speak. Each pass, he glances at the transcripts stacked at each elbow, and each pass, the stacks are taller. The American networks have stopped returning to regular programming now. The bulletins have become continuous, and their content is shifting. The subject is no longer the attack itself. It is what America is going to do next. By the end of the American afternoon, one kind of traffic is dominating the intercepts. It comes from city after city: New York, Chicago, Cleveland, Baltimore. Small towns the Japanese analysts have no file on. Kansas towns, Iowa towns. Towns in states the monitors would need a wall map to place. Lines outside recruiting stations. Men waiting on sidewalks before the offices open. Boys too young lying about their ages. Men rejected for flat feet and bad eyes arguing with the recruiting sergeants, insisting on service. In several cities, the offices stay open through the night to process them. The plan assumed a nation that would count the cost of war and flinch. The intercepts describe a nation forming a queue to join it. The senior monitor makes another pass. He does not comment. In Tokyo, meanwhile, the government is listening to an entirely different broadcast, its own. NHK, the national network, has opened the morning of December 8th with the imperial rescript declaring war against the United States and the British Empire. Martial music follows. Then bulletin after bulletin of victory from Hawaii and Malaya. Crowds gather at Shinto shrines. Extras hit the streets from every major newspaper. Enemy fleet annihilated, they read. Divine wind. New order in Asia. The men who chose this war are listening to the sound of their own triumph. The men whose job is to listen to the enemy are hearing something else. And their transcripts are beginning to pile up faster than the government can ignore them. Then the American night passes. Then, in Washington, morning. At noon Washington time, the receivers on every Japanese listening post lock onto a single frequency. The Congress of the United States is convening. The president is going to speak. And every man aboard the Nagato who has any sense of what the plan actually needs knows that this is the moment the war has been pointing toward from the beginning. Not the torpedoes, not the burning battleships. The first official words of the American government after absorbing the blow. If the strategy is sound, those words will carry hesitation, divided counsel, the opening bid of a nation looking for a way out of a fight it never wanted. 33 minutes past noon, in the chamber of the House of Representatives, a gavel falls. The speaker announces the President of the United States. The monitors press their headphones tight. What they are about to transcribe is 6.5 minutes long. It will outlive every man in the room. The voice that comes through the shortwave is one they already know. They have transcribed Franklin Delano Roosevelt for years. The fireside chats, the campaigns, speeches, the careful promises to keep American boys out of foreign wars. They know his cadence the way a sentry knows footsteps in the dark. What arrives now through the static is the same voice with everything careful stripped out of it. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The monitors write it down as they hear it. The sentence has already done its work before their pencils stop moving. In Tokyo's war planning, the attack was an opening position, a catastrophe delivered, then a settlement offered. One line of that speech has just reclassified it entirely. Not a defeat to be absorbed, a crime to be answered. There is no negotiation with infamy. The speech runs on, and it is short, brutally short. No survey of options, no appeal for calm deliberation. Roosevelt lists the morning's attacks as they came across the wire: Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, Midway. Each name lands like an item in an indictment. And then the sentence the whole listening apparatus of Japan was built to catch. The American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. Absolute. The monitors transcribe the word that forecloses the strategy. Behind Roosevelt's voice, the receivers carry another sound, the chamber itself. The speech is interrupted, again and again, by a roar that needs no translation. These are the same congressmen whose isolationist speeches fill years of Japanese transcript files. Senators who filibustered aid to Britain. Representatives who voted session after session to keep America home. They are on their feet. They are cheering for war. 6.5 minutes. That is all it takes. What follows moves with a speed no planner in Tokyo modeled. The Senate votes within the hour, 82 to nothing. The House follows, 388 in favor. Clerks record one vote against, a single voice in the entire Congress of the United States. Her name is Jeannette Rankin, Republican, Montana. She is 61 years old. In 1916, she became the first woman ever elected to the United States Congress. In 1917, she was one of 50 House members who voted against the declaration of war on Germany. That vote cost her the seat. 24 years later, in 1940, the voters of Montana sent her back. Now she is standing alone in the well of the House. Colleagues around her are shouting at her to change her vote, make it unanimous, just this once. She refuses. As a woman, she says, "I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." Breaks into hisses and boos. When the vote is closed, she leaves the floor and takes refuge in a telephone booth in a nearby corridor, waiting for the crowd outside to move. A Washington Post reporter will describe her in the next day's paper as looking like a cornered rabbit. The monitors in Tokyo log the tally. In the arithmetic of the war councils, this number was supposed to look different. The planners had counted on the America of their transcript files, the divided America, the America where a declaration of war would fight its way through weeks of debate, where isolationist blocs would demand terms and timetables, where the very size of the political opposition would become Japan's silent negotiating partner across the ocean. The opposition, after one morning, is one woman in a phone booth. And within days, the receivers begin to carry the sound of the rest of it dissolving. Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, the most famous voice of the America First Committee. The man who filled Madison Square Garden in 1941, telling ordinary Americans that this was not their fight, issues a statement. Now that war has come, he says his country must fight. He asks to serve. The America First Committee itself, hundreds of thousands of members strong, votes to disband. Its national committee urges its members to support the war effort with everything they have. The movement, Japan's strategy, was leaning on liquidates itself in under a week. At the foreign ministry desks, the transcripts of December 1941 are beginning to read like a controlled experiment. Question: Will a catastrophic blow divide the Americans or unite them? The listening posts have collected the answer with professional precision. The calm bulletins, the recruiting lines, the vote, the single dissent. The isolinists folding. The intelligence is complete. It is timely. It is accurate. There is no mechanism anywhere in the Japanese government for acting on it. Because in Tokyo, a different broadcast owns the morning. NHK carries the emperor's rescript. Newspapers print victory totals from Hawaii. The army faction that pushed for war points to the burning American fleet as proof of everything it promised. To stand in a government meeting in December 1941 and read aloud from American radio transcripts to argue that the enemy's voice matters more than the enemy's sunken ships is not analysis. Defeatism, and men have been assassinated in Tokyo for less. Yamamoto carries the arithmetic privately. 6 months of running wild have begun. The clock started the moment Fuchida's sig reached the Nagato. In letters home and in remarks to intimates that will surface only after his death, his assessment stays cold. The war has started badly in the only way that cannot be repaired. The fleet won the morning. The radio says the nation lost the year. No one in Japan can hear it yet, because the running wild is real, and it is about to look like proof that the plan is working. Across the map on the Nagato's operations wall, the arrows are already moving. Guam falls on the 10th of December, days. Off the coast of Malaya, on the same day, land-based Japanese torpedo bombers attack the British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse. Both go to the bottom in a single afternoon. The Royal Navy's Far Eastern deterrent gone. Hong Kong surrenders on Christmas Day. Down the Malay Peninsula, Japanese infantry moves on bicycles, faster than the British can build defensive lines. Manila falls in early January. On the 15th of February, Singapore itself surrenders. 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops go into captivity. It is the largest capitulation in British military history. The Dutch East Indies fall, and with them, the oil the entire war was launched to secure. 6 months of running wild. Yamamoto is delivering it to the day. But aboard the Nagato, the admiral is reading 2 wars at once now. One is on the map, where the perimeter grows exactly as planned. The other is in the intercept summaries, where American radio has changed its subject. The bulletins of December, attacks, alarms, blackouts have given way to a different vocabulary entirely. Production schedules, shipyard launchings, war bond drives with quotas announced and met. In January, the president goes on the air and names numbers for the year ahead. 60,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, 8 million tons of shipping. The monitors transcribe the figures. No one in Tokyo has a file that makes them answerable. Yamamoto does not need a file. He has seen the factories the numbers come from. He carries a second arithmetic. From the morning of the attack itself, the accounting of what the strike did not hit. His planners had wanted a third wave over Pearl Harbor, aimed at the fuel farms and the repair yards. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, 54 years old, cautious by nature, a torpedo officer entrusted with carriers he never quite believed in, judged the risk of American counterattack too high. He turned the strike force for home. The oil tanks he spared held more fuel than Japan's entire national reserve. So the harbor that was supposed to be a graveyard becomes a workshop instead. American radio itself tells the story week by week in the confident tones the monitors have learned to dread. Salvage crews over the sunken battleships, ships refloated, hulls patched and towed to the west coast for rebuilding. Of the battleships shattered on December 7th, all but 2 will eventually return to service. And the ships that mattered most were never there at all. The American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, they were at sea on the morning of the attack. Decisive battle doctrine, the creed the Imperial Japanese Navy was raised on, requires the enemy fleet to be destroyed in one annihilating engagement. The engagement happened. The fleet, in the form that will actually decide this war, was absent. Yamamoto, of all men, knows what that absence means. Because he is the officer who spent the 1930s arguing against his own battleship admirals that the carrier had already replaced the battleship as the weapon that wins. His attack has just proven his own theory on the wrong Navy. And then, in April, the war the monitors have been transcribing stops being something overheard from across an ocean. Just after noon on the 18th, air raid sirens sound over Tokyo. 16 American medium bombers, twin-engine B-25s, launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet at a range no doctrine said was possible, come in low over the capital and bomb it in daylight. The damage is light. The arithmetic is not. Radio Tokyo has spent 4 months telling the Japanese nation that the home islands are beyond the enemy's reach. Residents in the streets watch American aircraft cross a sky the broadcast said was closed. For the first time, the two broadcasts, Japan's and America's, describe the same event, and only one of them is telling the truth. The raid detonates inside the Navy's high command. The bombers came from somewhere. That somewhere is the American carrier fleet, the ships that were absent from Pearl Harbor, now operating close enough to touch the Emperor's palace. Yamamoto has been pressing for months for authorization to finish what December left undone. Now he gets it. He is going to draw the American carriers into the decisive battle the doctrine has always promised, the one he did not fight in December. The target he has chosen is a coral atoll called Midway. The plan will commit nearly the entire combined fleet. And what he stakes on it, he stakes knowing the clock. The 6 months he promised Konoe expire at the beginning of June. The intercept summaries keep arriving. The shipyards, the aircraft plants, the training programs graduating pilots by the thousand. Every week that passes shifts the arithmetic further from him. The decisive battle is coming. It must come now. While Japan's carriers and Japan's veteran airmen still outweigh what America has managed to build. The window is real. It is also the last one. And there is one factor his plan does not weigh, because no one aboard the Nagato knows it exists. In a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, in the month of May, 1942, a man is working 18-hour days. His name is Joseph Rochefort. He is 42 years old, an American naval officer of unremarkable appearance, a full commander in the United States Navy. He often works in a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers because his feet ache on the concrete. His unit is called Station Hypo. Officially, it does not exist. For months, Rochefort's cryptanalysts have been chewing on the Japanese Navy's operational code, the one designated JN-25, the one that is now carrying, in growing volume, the traffic of the Midway Plan. They have been reading it, not all of it, not perfectly, but enough. By late May, they know something is being aimed at a target the Japanese messages call, in the code, AF. Rochefort believes AF is Midway. His superiors in Washington are not sure. They think it could be the Aleutians. It could be the West Coast. It could be a feint. So Rochefort tries something. He sends a message to the small American garrison on Midway Atoll and asks them to broadcast in the clear that their freshwater distillation plant has broken down. 2 days later, a Japanese intercept comes in. It reports in JN-25 that AF is short of fresh water. Trap closes. The target is confirmed. The date is fixed. The composition of the force is broken out, message by message. Which carriers? Which cruisers? Which routes? Which times? By the last week of May, the United States Pacific Fleet is not waiting for Yamamoto's plan to arrive. It is reading his plan on the way in. On the flag bridge of the carrier Akakagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi orders the 4 carriers of his strike force to sea. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The same corps that struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. On the Akagi, Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, 39 years old, the man who transmitted Tora 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 into the Nagato's radio room on the first morning of the war, is confined below with acute appendicitis. He has been operated on. He will watch what comes next from a stretcher on the ship's island, unable to fly. On the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, the Japanese carriers are recovering aircraft from a strike against the atoll and rearming for a second strike. Their decks are crowded. Fueled planes, stacked ordnance, bombs and torpedoes in the open. being switched from one to the other under Nagumo's confused orders. American dive bombers, guided to the exact patch of ocean by the broken codes, fall out of an empty sky. 5 minutes. That is how long it takes. Akagi is hit and burns. Kaga is hit and burns. Soryu is hit and burns. Fuchida, on his stretcher, is carried through the smoke. Both ankles are broken in the evacuation. Below him, on the hangar deck, the fires reach the stacked ordnance and consume it. Hirju fights on into the afternoon and puts strikes into the American carrier Yorktown. By the following day, Hiryu too is a burning wreck. On her flag bridge, in the final hours, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon, 49 years old, a Princeton man, class of 1923, the officer many in the Imperial Navy had marked as Yamamoto's logical successor, refuses evacuation. Beside him, Captain Kaku Tomeo, the ship's commanding officer, refuses to leave as well. Yamaguchi takes off his cap. He gives it to an officer who is leaving. It is the closest thing to a message he sends home. The destroyers pull away. The cap makes the crossing. The Admiral does not. 4 of the 6 carriers that struck Pearl Harbor are on the bottom of the Pacific. It is 6 months, almost to the day, since Fuchida's signal reached the Nagato. The doctrine of the decisive battle has finally produced one. It decided against the Navy that believed in it. The veteran air crews, the men who trained for years before the war, the men no crash program can replace. Many of them go down with the carriers. Many more go down in the sea. What follows in the intercept summaries is not a battle anymore. It is a subtraction. On an island called Guadalcanal in the Solomons, a 6-month grinding match begins that the Japanese supply system cannot feed. Soldiers on the island rename it Starvation Island. American radio, meanwhile, reports the launching of new fleet carriers on schedules the Japanese yards cannot match. Over the course of the war, American shipbuilders will commission more than 100 carriers of all types. Japan will complete a fraction of that number, and she cannot crew even those. Yamamoto does not live to see the arithmetic finish. On the 18th of April, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle bombers crossed Tokyo, he flies to the front at Bougainville in the northern Solomons to inspect his airfields and rally his exhausted air groups. His itinerary is transmitted ahead of him, encoded in the same family of ciphers that American codebreakers have already broken. 16 American P-38 Lightning fighters flying from Guadalcanal are waiting at the exact point on the map where his schedule says he will be. His bomber goes down, burning into the jungle. The codes gave the Americans his fleet at Midway. Then they gave the Americans him. The perimeter he built collapses island by island. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan in the summer of 1944. On Saipan, a cave, Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, the officer who once turned the strike force home from Pearl Harbor without hitting the fuel farms, takes his own life. From the airfields on Saipan, the new American B-29 bombers can reach Tokyo itself. The city the sirens warned in April 1942 now burns for real. On a single night, the 9th and 10th of March, 1945, low-altitude incendiary raids over Tokyo kill an estimated 100,000 people in a few hours. Whole districts of paper and wood are gone by morning. Then Hiroshima, the 6th of August, then Nagasaki, the 9th. On the 15th of August, 1945, the 2 broadcasts that have contradicted each other since December 1941 finally merge into one. NHK, the network that opened the war with martial music, carries a voice its listeners have never heard on the radio. The Emperor's own. He announces that the war is over. The empire that attacked Pearl Harbor has lost roughly 2 million military dead. Its fleet, its cities, and its government have been broken beyond any possibility of recovery. The war Japan designed to last 6 months has run 44. And the story returns at the end to a single room, Operations Center of the Nagato. In the dark of the 8th of December, 1941, 2 clocks on the wall, set to Tokyo and Hawaii, officers cheering over Fuchida's signal. And, in the corner of the celebration, receivers tuned across the Pacific, pulling in the calm American voices. The football game interrupted. the recruiting lines, the single dissenting vote, the word infamy, the entire outcome of the war arriving in plain speech on the first morning into rooms full of men transcribing it. The answer was in the transcripts before the fires at Pearl Harbor were out. Japan spent 44 more months learning it a second way. The Nagato herself outlived Yamamoto and outlived the war. She was seized intact by the United States Navy in August 1945. She was expended a year later as a target ship at the Bikini atomic tests. She sank on the 29th of July, 1946, and lies there still, beneath the lagoon. In Honolulu, the harbor was dredged, the fleet rebuilt. The war won from the same anchorage the plan assumed would be abandoned. The battleship Arizona was never raised. More than 900 of her crew remain inside her hull. Drops of her oil still rise to the surface every day.